Andrew, welcome.
Thanks.
Back to Sasin. You come quite often.
Yeah, I've been coming a lot these days.
Great to have you. Dr. Andrew Stotz is the co-founder and CEO of Stotz Investment Research, and he built this consultancy now for over 20 years of experience as an equity analyst at some large investment banks like Citigroup and CLSA and Maybank, and you're the former president of the CFA Society here in Thailand, and you're the co-founder of a coffee company called CoffeeWorks. You make premium coffee and sell it here. But what's amazing is you're this tireless creator of content and educational programs, including this incredibly long-running podcast you have called My Worst Investment Ever. And you have this valuation masterclass. I can go on and on about all the things that you do. But as I said, you're also a lecturer here at Sasin. So very happy to have you here. So again, welcome, Andrew.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
You know, you cite this value on your website. It's never stop learning. You know, what are the 2 or 3 things that the average person can do to be better than average?
So the first thing is something that my mom said to me when I was young is good, better, best. Never stop to rest until your good is better and your better is the best.
Wow. Can you say that again?
Good.
It's like a tongue twister.
Good, better, best. Never stop to rest until your good is better and your better is the best.
Okay.
And I think that from my perspective, I learned early on that repetition is my best way to learn. And by repeating something over and over again, I get to understand it. I would call myself actually a slow learner. I gotta map it out. I gotta write it out. I gotta work it out. I've got to do some examples. And so I actually think I'm a slow learner, but I think that that's what makes me a better teacher, is that because I gotta kind of muscle through it, then when I bring it to students, to my audience, to wherever, I've already thought it through quite carefully. So that's the first thing about the spirit of learning that I have, and where does that come from? But
what kind of forms does this repetition, how do you manifest it in actual behavior? So you read all these books and and so you consume them. Where does repetition come in so that you reinforce it?
So anything that I want to learn or I want to understand, I just got to do it over and over again. Podcast is a great example. I didn't care how many people would download it or how many people would see it or whatever. I wanted to do 100. I wanted to do 20 first, and then I wanted to get to 50. And I just got better and better. And as I got better and better, then, things started getting more smooth, and I started to understand a lot more. So that's the first. But let's say, take the example of one of my online courses, Valuation Masterclass, and the Valuation Masterclass Bootcamp. Basically, it's all about repetition, teaching how to value a company and then do it again, and then do it again. And what you find is that students have to redo the work 5 times in the beginning until they've passed through a peer review and a feedback until they get it. Mm-hmm. And so that's also the way I teach, is repetition. Mm-hmm. And so anything that I want to do, I want to do it. I saw Elon Musk was talking about his SpaceX, I think it's called, I can't remember his
rocket company.
Yeah, the rockets, and he was like, we need to fire more rockets. If we don't fire more rockets, we don't get the practice of landing and all of that. Now, you asked another question about, how can people learn more or learn better? I would say that we're in an era where people are having a really hard time learning.
Really?
Really, really.
Even though we have an abundance of learning tools at our fingertip, there's just so much available now. Why is it so hard now?
I think it's hard because of distraction. Number one, we're distracted all the time. And that just wasn't the case. When I was young, you go sit down at your desk in your room, and there's nobody calling, you didn't have a phone in your room. Mm-hmm. And it just wasn't interruptions. And there's just interruptions all the time. That's number one. I think that iPhones have been just extremely destructive to people's ability to stay focused. And so, iPhones, or let's say mobile phones in general. So I have to keep mine out of my office, when it's the prime time. But I would say one of the big things that I would recommend people to do is find your peak time. When is the time that you have the most amount of energy to learn? The most amount of energy to do anything? And my time is early in the morning, let's say 4, 5, 6 a.m. until 8, 9, 10 a.m. Done. Anything that I ever want to accomplish in my life must happen during that time. When I was working on my dissertation for my PhD, I was like, okay, I'm moving my exercise out of that space and I'm replacing it with my work on my dissertation. So for 7 months, every single morning, early in the morning, first couple of hours was working on that. Because working on that can be quite tedious,
right?
And so
do you also try to solve your thorniest problems at that time?
Always. And so another trick that I've learned is to find that peak time. And when I was working in companies, let's say Citibank as an example, it didn't really matter whether I was like hyper productive or not. And that is just the ultimate challenge, and you get blasted. I can remember there was one place I went in, there was a hedge fund. These guys were really brilliant.
And arrogant.
And there's some arrogant people, but there's just a lot of good people, and they're smart as hell. And there was 4 of them lined up, and I sat down at the table, and they were like, the first thing that they said is they looked at my report, and they said, there's an error right here. And I was like, oh my God. But I was able to quickly recover by saying, yes, but that error doesn't change my final conclusion. And then they said, okay, that's a fair point. And I learned something in Thailand too. In Thailand, we don't really express anger.
Right.
And so when these guys started hitting me hard. And one was asking me a very tough question. Another one was preparing for the next question. And so they were just like one after the other. And they were tough, and they were a bit, I wouldn't say rude, but just tough. But I just decided that the harder that they hit me, the softer I would get in my response.
How old were you at this stage?
I was 20, I was, let's say 30, 33 or something like that. So, I'd been around, but right. I was confident in what I did, but I also just learned that.
But this is sort of a Thai trait you picked up, is that what you're saying? Or
yeah, I would just say that I learned that, you're never going to succeed in Thailand if your objective is to rise to a confrontation. Mm-hmm. I always learned, I think in Thailand, that you pull back from a confrontation. Right. Because the gain that you think you're going to get just isn't there. And so that's something that I learned. I learned a lot of things from being in Thailand. I've lived in Thailand more now than I lived in the U.S. And one of the big things I learned is family. I've learned 6 ways to lose your money. This is the 6 ways that people lose their money. The first way that they do it is they don't do research. They just go rushing in. Even the smartest people that I've interviewed that are really, diligent researchers, but they don't do their research for some reason.
What is that, just an overconfidence?
Yeah, I think well, let's give it another example. So one of my good friends, he was the president of CFA Society in Pakistan. He came onto the show, and he basically, very, very, smart guy, very thoughtful, very careful. And then someone called him out of the blue and says, hey, I got a property in London, and, it's going to be developed over time. It's going to be worth a lot more money, and this is the chance to get in right now, and we're going to close this on Friday. So if you want to book your spot, you need to send us 12,000, pounds at the time. And so he sent him 12,000 pounds, and he never saw that money again. And it's like, what? So he shared that. It's just like, there's cognitive failures, which brings me to, the second way that people lose their money is that they're not, they don't assess and manage risk well. And that, is a big, big one where people just aren't assessing the risk very well. And I always recommend that people separate the research that you do about return from the research you do about risk. So like, for instance, when our company in Coffee Works, we were looking at expanding into Vietnam, and we had an opportunity to partner with a global brand there. And so my business partner Dale went there to get all the information, and we agreed that we'd meet on a Monday one night at the office, and he would present the argument for the upside potential. And he did. And then I asked some questions about the upside, but didn't ask that much. And then we went and had dinner. And then the next week, we agreed that we would meet and talk about the risk. So by separating the risk and return, we were able to have a much more fruitful conversation about the risks without all the attachment to the upside. And we ended up deciding not to do it. We thought that we could expand our business equally fast in Thailand, but with a lot less risk. And so that's the second one. And I think the third one is really about emotions, right? And emotions and flawed thinking is one that just gets people, tripped up over time. And so it's easy to get caught up in that. So emotions is a big thing. And,
And how do you counteract that? Is it the people you surround yourself with? Is it greater self-awareness?
Stop in the name of love. The point is, you got to stop. Don't rush any investment. You've got to just stop. And the second thing that I recommend in that case is write it down. So put a line, take one piece of paper, go sit down at a Starbucks or wherever it is you like to go. Take one piece of paper, draw a line down the middle, say pros and cons, and start writing. And then eventually what you need to do is talk to somebody that you trust. It's like a third party who's got a good mind on it. And then listen to what they say. That's the hard part.
Right. Basically, slow down the processes and don't let your emotions carry you away, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, think about how many times you bought something and then right after you bought it, you're like, it's not
or
as
the
exciting.
email you shouldn't have waited on. These videos you've been pumping out on competitive advantage and the strategic competitive advantages of companies, right? You've been releasing these videos on YouTube. What makes this company great? You've profiled Coca-Cola, Toyota, Hermes, and they've been, and I think Apple recently, and I've been watching these with fascination. But you're doing a deep dive on their financials in connection to their competitive advantages, and one was on Samsung, and you talk about how strong their net profit margin is. I think you're saying over the past 2 years, like 16%, and the average globally is like something like 6%. So they're really strong, and they've got this fantastic innovative DNA, and they're successful in a highly competitive market, but they're not up to snuff in terms of being financially world class. And so, I'm just using that one as an example. But what is your standard when you do a deep dive on these numbers, and you're alone by yourself, and what are you using as a standard to
the whole
assess world class?
That whole thing of world class benchmarking came about when I was an analyst. I was trying to think about what's a standard way that I could look at companies. And, when you're an analyst, you're looking at the ROE of the company or whatever, those different measures. And most analysts, we have like 30 different ratios. And I just felt like I was lost in a sea of ratios. So what I started to do was identify different ratios, and then I would test the relationship between that ratio and share price performance. And if that ratio had a high correlation to share price performance, or an improvement in that ratio had a high relationship with share price performance, then I knew, okay, that's a great ratio. The second thing I wanted to do was, because I was developing the world-class benchmarking scorecard, not only as an analyst, but for my own company, CoffeeWorks, I needed it to be really simple. So if we look at return on invested capital, it's a great measure, but it's too complicated. And people just won't understand it. And so I have to balance those two things. So I ended up, the two main measures I'm looking at is return on assets and earnings growth. Those are the two main. There's more to it. What I'm revealing in those is the top of a triangle that goes down more. And the point is, so I know that those two measures, when combined, account for almost all of the performance measurement that I need. You could have some
consistency over several years.
Yeah, and that's what I'm looking for. But the point is that it's not enough. Think about a business. If you're gonna, let's say last year you had earnings growth of 10%, and this year you've had earnings growth of 15%, and you think, well, we'll give a bonus, and let's reward everybody for the hard work because it went from 10 to 15. But what if the industry earned 10% last year in earnings growth and they earned 25% this year? All of a sudden, wait a minute, are you really financially world class? And that's where I compare every company against its global peers. And that's really the gold standard. If a company can maintain that performance relative to global peers, okay, then they're really financially world class. And I think, we all studied Michael Porter when we're young, talking about corporate strategy and all that. And the main message that I got from that many years ago was that in order for something to be a true competitive advantage, it has to show in the numbers. Don't tell me about how great your company is and whatever it is that you're doing. I am only going to look at the results in the number.
Yeah, I think you said that Coca-Cola and Apple were top tier.
Yeah, so they were ranked, I use a scale of 1 to 10, and so if there was 100 companies in that particular universe that I'm looking at, if it was in the top 10%, it would be ranked number 1. If it's top 20, it would be, ranked number 2. And to get to that point is hard. To sustain that is really hard.
Right.
And that's what's so impressive about financially world-class companies.
But what's the difference between a Coca-Cola and a Toyota, which seem in your rankings quite different? Toyota actually sort of
Kind of
middle
average,
average,
but
middle of the
a little bit
road
below average.
in terms of your standards, right? So what are the major reasons for that?
I would say that in the case of Toyota, in this case we'll look at Toyota, they have core competencies.
Yes, pretty strong ones.
Absolutely. But in order to have a competitive advantage, it has to show through in the financial performance. And therefore, you can argue that they don't have competitive advantage. And that's a really harsh statement because, I have a huge amount of respect for Toyota. And I think that what happens in any business, I know in my own business life, things go in waves. Maybe you're investing in the growth of the company, and maybe you're saying, look, we're not going to have that world-class performance for the next 3 years because we're building out, a whole new business line or whatever. Well, I came to Thailand, and I came from a pretty good family, and I didn't go through family traumas and all that type of stuff. And so what I learned from Thai people was to take care of your parents, to keep your family, together and all that. And so I really have done the best that I can in that with my own family back in the U.S. And so first of all, I have an appreciation of family. I think that in America, there's forces that are against family, which is just, crazy. And I think that those...
What do you mean? You don't have to get that specific, but what do you mean? Forces against family.
I think that there are people that think that... well, just think about it this way, right? If you go back 100 years in Thailand or in America, as an example, most people lived on farms, right? And so you had to take care of each other right there. So the migration to cities already started to break that apart.
Sure.
And then I think that there are politicians in particular that want people to be less dependent on the family and more dependent on the government, on the state, because that gives them political power. And so there's lots of forces that I've been witnessing that I think it's getting harder and harder for a family to protect their children from all kinds of nonsense that's going on in this world. And I now see that role is really critical. And the second thing I think, and I think I've gone through it too, I think that there is, religion in America is just almost disappearing in some ways. And I think that Thailand has these two things very strong, family and religion. And so first, I'm kind of on a mission to help Thai people recognize the value of these two things. Not to say that any particular religion is right or wrong or whatever, but the power of the community that religion brings and other things. So that's the kind of the family angle. And then if we talk about business, the holy grail in America is publicly listed companies with a CEO running it, and it's no longer, and all of the ESG, the governance in ESG stuff, it's about, trying to prevent actually from families dominating the businesses sometimes.
Why is that?
Because they think, well, we want professional management. We want to have a separate, chairman, a separate CEO. We don't want related party transactions, and all that. Well, part of what happens in family businesses is there's a ton of related party transactions. And to say that related party transactions are wrong, I think is wrong. To say if they're hidden or they're used to extract money out of the business, that's wrong, particularly if it's a listed company. It doesn't really matter if you're just a family business and you're moving money between the businesses. But if it's a publicly listed company, that you've got to protect that. But the point I'm just trying to make is that I think also that you can have continuity in management. And that's where Toyota is fascinating. 7 of the 12 CEOs were family members. Yeah. And so there's more.
And one most recently.
Yeah. And so I just think that we need to protect that. And I think that there's another issue that I see with families is that the fathers and mothers who ran the businesses, started them 20 years ago, 50 years ago, they're retired. And they've handed it over to the second generation. And the second generation is doing the best that they can. But they may not be as great as the father or the mother was. And therefore, they're looking for places like Sasin to come and upskill themselves and try to say, how do I professionalize? So I see a lot of family businesses want to professionalize. And then the final thing about family businesses is that the third generation, how do you keep them involved in the business? Or do you keep them involved in the business? Or how do you transition there? And so, there's a lot of young people in Thailand that just want to go work in investment banking. And so parents send them, let's say, to the US, go get an education, come back. Maybe you're going to help us run this business, maybe not. But the young person may say, I want to go work in investment banking. So what I'm trying to do also is say, if you can make your family business more profitable as possible, it provides more opportunity for the new generation. And it provides opportunity for the older generation to say, okay, well, let's list it on the stock market or let's sell it or whatever. But without the profitability in it, which really brings me back to the other thing that I'm just so serious about, and that is capitalism. And I'm talking about shareholder, not stakeholder capitalism. The beauty of capitalism and bringing products to market and bringing pricing to market and just getting brutalized out in the market, and what the free market does to force a company or an organization to keep iterating until they find success. So, it's family businesses and it's the power of capitalism that I'm really just on a kick on these days.
That's great.
Get me excited.
So really the biggest issue for family businesses are the obvious one, that generation transition to the second or third generations. Yep. It's just natural that there's less interest in running that business in those next generations.
Yep.
I mean, you even hinted that the starters, the founders were better, and of course, I assume in terms of the passion and drive of the foundational business. But it's that's the major issue. It's how do you interest them enough, and if you have a wide variety of opportunities, and maybe you might be able to find ways of interest of them. I think you were implying, but
I think that's what makes Toyota such a great example. It wasn't a family member that was running the company all the time.
Right.
It doesn't have to be. So one of my clients, they talk about legacy and what legacy they want to leave. And I came to the meeting with a document that was a story of my great-grandfather, and he started an architectural firm in Pittsburgh that my grandfather took over, and then eventually my grandfather sold it because my dad didn't want to be in architecture. He was in chemistry and something different. So eventually sold it to another group, and that company still exists, and the history of what my great-grandfather did is still a legacy. So legacy doesn't have to be that your kids have to run it, but keeping the business, keeping the ownership. Thailand is interesting because we have a lot of different family banks. Right. Every bank was a family bank in the beginning, and now we have almost no family banks.
Right.
Why was that? Very simple. 1997 crisis. Almost every single family had to go out and raise capital at extremely terrible terms, and they got diluted so that K-Bank family, the Lam Sum family, only owns a tiny amount of that bank. There's one bank where the family still owns at least 25, maybe 40% of the bank. Which bank is that? Bangkok Bank.
Yeah.
And that, I believe, was because of the Kunchatri Supornpanit, who basically saw the 97 crisis coming and immediately, number one, raised capital from foreign investors at a very high price just before it happened. So he got capital in. And then they were the only bank that had they had bank bonds in US dollars all around the world, where people were owning Bangkok Bank bonds. And basically when the crisis happened in 97, those people owning those bonds was like, oh my God, I bought this for 100, but it's really only worth 5. So what did Kunchatri do? He went to those people and said, I'll buy it for 5. And he took the excess cash that they had at the bank and he bought those back at 5. The 95 difference was like loan forgiveness. And you can book that as a profit in your P&L. And he was able to book, I think, about 8.9 billion baht in 1998 or 1999 that then supported his capital, so that between the foreign shares that he issued and then that conversion or that buyback of debt, he was able to not have to dilute the family stakeholder. And so, part of what I want to do is help families maintain control of their businesses and have the continuity of that business.
Edwards Deming, for people who don't know, came out of the war as an expert in sort of statistical control and was not able to get so many followers in America, but went to Japan and was taught in Japan, I think, in 1950, in the post-war years of Japan, and turned manufacturing around, right? And what made in Japan used to be, a terrible phrase for Japanese products, turned into a very positive image for Japan. How did you meet him, and what did you learn from him?
So he's the father of the quality movement.
Yeah.
And he was born in 1900. So in the 50s, when he went to Japan after World War II, he was already 50 years old. So he had been teaching and doing a lot of other stuff. He was a real master in statistics and understanding statistics. But he originally studied his PhDs and his masters in physics. So he was a really brilliant guy. And I was working at Pepsi. I went to work at Pepsi when I graduated university with an undergrad in finance, and I went to work in manufacturing and warehouse. I was just a young supervisor, a trainee, and they were putting me through a lot of different training, and I was doing my MBA. But I had bought in 1987 or 88, I bought a IBM PC with the floppy disks and all that stuff, and then I tried to teach myself how to use it. And I didn't know much, but I knew more than the other guy that I work with, and so I started making charts and graphs and putting them up on the wall. And then people are like, and then one of my bosses said, "Oh, you understand quality. There's this seminar happening that some Pepsi people are going to in Washington, D.C., that you should go to, George Washington University." And I was like, I'm there. I didn't know anything about him or anything, but I just thought this was cool. So I got on a plane, I flew to Washington, D.C. from L.A., and I sat down and I did what I had been doing in school, is I just sat down in the front row. It was particularly intimidating because there was probably 300, 400 people in the room, and they were all older executives. So I was like a young kid. So I just sat practically this close to the guy. And then he just blew my mind. Just absolutely blew my mind.
Yeah, because he was a rock star at that stage, right? Because the whole total quality movement had accelerated Japan to...
Well, he said things that just...
Number one, as Ezra Vogel called him, right?
Yep. He said things that really turned my thinking upside down.
What, for example, what?
First of all, he said that the problems of the business is the fault of management. Stop blaming the worker. And that's pretty harsh when you've got a room full of managers. He's like, it's your fault. They don't want to hear that. They want, employees don't have the morale and they don't have... That's bullshit. That's what he basically said. And that was pretty powerful to me. I was like, whoa, because I could see... And then he said, that the next thing he said is that the results of the output of your business or of a business process is not the result of the worker in the business. It's the result of the system that the worker is operating within. If you don't have a budget for the tools that they need to do the job right, there's nothing they can do. And so it helped me to understand that the job of management is the system.
I mean, drive fear out, is that also?
That's another
an
one.
Indictment of management. Basically, managers create an atmosphere of fear, so no one's going to speak up.
Yeah. So that was another one to drive out fear. I think that was kind of, pretty interesting. And then one that I think still resonates today is, everybody's keen on KPIs. Everybody knows key performance indicators. And what he said is throw them out. Stop doing that.
Because
what you're doing is you're you can't think of business in silos and individuals. If you're trying to incentivize people through this type of methodology, they are naturally going to do things that are not beneficial for the whole system, but beneficial for their department or their division or for themselves. And I know anybody listening to this, anybody watching this knows, they've seen it. I mean, I had a case, a friend of mine, he had a deal that he was going to do. It was a $10 million deal for his company. He was in Saudi Arabia, and he called to a colleague in the U.S. and said, "Can you meet me there to close this deal? I need you there to do this." And he said, "Sorry, I can't. I gotta finish my KPI for the year, or else I don't get my bonus for my wife and kid." We are creating competition within our companies when we should be focusing outside of our companies. And we're not building teamwork. And Thais are so good at teamwork. And now I see KPIs everywhere. It's destroying the teamwork potential. And think about it this way. The human potential is enormous. But the way you get the best out of people is through intrinsic motivation. It's not carrot and stick. And a lot of young people are thinking that if I can just be behind a computer and I can see the KPIs and see who's not performing and then just, maybe I'll send an electric shock to them. Right? Yeah. That is not the way you're going to get excellence. And so I got a chance to study with Dr. Deming, and then he came to LA a year or so later. So by the time he came to LA, it was 1992, so he was 92 years old.
Wow.
And he taught, for those seminars, it was like 2 days. I think his normal one was a 4-day, but he was doing 2 days by that time. He had a nurse there, and he had an oxygen tank behind him. And I just think, and that guy
working till the day he dies.
And that's part of what inspired me. People ask, when are you going to retire? Never. I'm never going to retire. Why would I retire if I love what I'm doing?
Exactly.
Now, I mean, obviously, if I don't love what I'm doing anymore, or if I was working for retirement, or if I had some other things to do. But for me, I just love. And so Dr. Deming, I got to study with him twice. I have these great pictures, and he signed my stuff, and it was great.
Thank you very much, Andrew. This was a fun talk.
Anytime. Yeah, it's great. I appreciate the questions and the time that you took, and excited for the things that you're creating.
Well, we will talk again. Thanks a lot, Andrew.
Yep, thanks.
All right.